Hi, everyone. I hope that you're all having a fantastic night. So we're going to go through Daniel 5 in this video. It is a fairly short chapter. It's only 31 verses, and it tells the story of the downfall of the Babylonian Empire. We were introduced to the fact that this was going to happen in Daniel 2 with the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had of the statue. There was a head of gold, which represented the Babylonian Empire and Nebuchadnezzar himself. Then there was a chest and arms of silver, which represented the next empire that would come, which we will see the beginning of in Daniel 5, represents the kingdom being divided between the Medes and the Persians. Next, you have the belly and thighs of brass, which represents what will be the Grecian Empire, and we will be introduced to that later in the book of Daniel also. And then you have the legs and feet of iron mixed with miry clay, which represents the fourth kingdom, which is these four in the statue are akin to the four beasts that we're going to see in Daniel 7. The lion, the bear, the leopard, and the beast that is diverse from the other three, which devour, break in pieces, stamp the residue, all of that. So Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 are very closely related. And in Daniel 5, we see the end of the empire, the lion, which represented the head of gold and Nebuchadnezzar's statue, the Babylonian Empire. Hi, Verna, welcome. And we will see the introduction of the bear, which represents the Medes and the Persians, which was the chest and arms of silver in Daniel 2. So with that being said, let us get into Daniel 5. Now, when we left off in Daniel 4, we were introduced to the warning that God gave Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was paying lip service to God, saying, "Oh, the great God of the Jews." When it came down to it, time passed. I believe it was a year passed at the end of 12 months. Nebuchadnezzar is walking into his palace and he sees all these great things, and his kingdom has been enriched, and he's gotten such a place of wealth and prestige. And he's like, I did this on my own. Look how great I am. So he goes from paying lip service to God. God gives him a dream and a warning, and Daniel interprets it. And a year later, Nebuchadnezzar, out of sight, out of mind, with this interpretation and this warning, he's like, I'm the best. I'm the best. And he was brought low. He was turned into a wild beast. He was eating outside, living in the grass, given the heart of a wild beast, and basically brought low. And God says, I appoint rulers. I depose rulers. This is all at my behest, not because of you, because of me. So we're going to impress that upon people. So while Nebuchadnezzar was deposed for the 7 seasons, obviously there was going to have been a ruler in his place. We are introduced to that ruler, which is his son, Belshazzar. Now, it's interesting because Daniel was given a Babylonian name, Belteshazzar. There's one extra syllable in his name versus the king of Babylon. It's Belteshazzar, which is Daniel's name. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were renamed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Their names were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The Hebrew names, and then they were renamed Babylonian, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel was renamed Belteshazzar. I don't know what that extra syllable represents, but if somebody wants to look that up and let me know, I'd appreciate it. Nebuchadnezzar's son was named Belshazzar, minus the extra syllable te. So it's just kind of interesting. Like I said, I haven't looked that up. I don't know what the extra syllable means, but that is the difference between what Daniel was renamed and what Nebuchadnezzar's son is named. So again, Belshazzar is probably the correct pronunciation of that. But he would have reigned in Nebuchadnezzar's stead when Nebuchadnezzar was turned into this wild beast man, and or after Nebuchadnezzar died. Anyway, either way, when we encounter him in Daniel 5, we see that he is the ruler. He is not friendly toward the Jews in the same type of manner that Nebuchadnezzar would have been. And we're going to see the ramifications of that. Belshazzar, the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. Daniel 5:1. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem. Now, the historical part of this, if you guys have not been along for the ride, or if you're just unfamiliar with that, Nebuchadnezzar, we were introduced to him in chapter 1 amidst the third and final exile of the Babylonian captivity. The Jews were carted off captive to Babylon in part of 3 different exiles, beginning in 607, 606, somewhere around there BC. The next one happened circa 600, 599 BC, somewhere around there. And then the third of the exiles would have occurred about 586 BC. In the third and final exile of the Babylonian captivity, that is when Jerusalem was sacked and burned and the temple was destroyed. Solomon's temple was destroyed. So from the beginning of the first exile all the way to the end of the Babylonian captivity, which is going to be coming to an end forthwith because Babylon is coming to an end. So from the beginning of the first exile all the way to the end of it, there would be 70 years. Jeremiah prophesied about this in Jeremiah 25:11, that, where am I? Jeremiah 25:11. He prophesied that specifically, the whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. So from the first exile of the Babylonian captivity all the way to the end of the captivity, which comes just after Babylon ceases being the world dominating empire, Israel was in exile in Babylon. This was one of the curses in the law expressed in the book of Deuteronomy, also in Jeremiah, for not following the law. So because Israel was led by wicked kings and ceased following God according to the law demanded that Israel be carted out of her land. Like I said, it was one of the curses for not following the law. So when we get to Daniel 9, Daniel, understanding that this is one of the curses of the law, that God was angry with them, he's praying for God to remove the curse and allow Israel to go back to her land and rebuild her temple, the temple that was destroyed in the third and final exile of the Babylonian captivity. So because Solomon's temple was destroyed, again, circa 586 BC, and all of the vessels of the temple were brought into Babylon, which we learn about in Daniel 1. Now in Daniel 5, we encounter said vessels, said holy vessels from the holy temple of God, house of God that was sacked and destroyed. Belshazzar is basically making a heathen toast from sacred vessels. And God says, oh, no, you don't. Those are mine. The gold is mine. The silver is mine. Actually, in the book of Joel, he says something very similar. No. Yes. Part of the recompense for the judgment of the nations in the end of times will be something similar to what occurred of Solomon's temple during the Babylonian captivity, because there is nothing new under the sun and history always repeats itself. In the end times, and we know that the book of Daniel is a preview of the end times, so this is another end times thing that relates to the book of Joel. We know that there is going to be a third and final temple built as the strength behind covenant confirmation. If you've heard me talk about this, you know, and I will talk about this more when we get to Daniel 9. Got a whole book written about this. In fact, 3 books written about this, where you find this information. But we know that there will be a temple built in the 70th week as the strength behind covenant confirmation to begin the count of the 70th week. Israel will be judged, all of that stuff. Just like in the Babylonian captivity, when Israel was carted captive from her land, the temple was destroyed and the temple vessels were carted off into strange land. In the 70th week, when the temple is desolated, not destroyed, but when it is desolated, there will be a judgment for those who cart off the things from the temple, the sacred vessels from the house of the Lord. Now, one of the things that people have an issue with when I say that the tribulation temple and the millennial temple are the same, they're like, no, they're not. But we don't ever see a tribulation temple described in the Old Testament. In the prophetic record, there's only one physical house left to be built, and that's Ezekiel's. We do not see a different temple referred to than that in the tribulation and in the 70th week. Moreover, in two places in Scripture, we have the tribulation temple referred to as the house of the Lord. In Revelation 11, rise, measure the temple of God. Tells them to leave out the measuring of the outer court. Do you know that that's one of the reasons why people say, oh, Ezekiel's temple is way too big. It couldn't be that in the tribulation. But it is. But you just don't know that, right? Like out in the plain text of Scripture doesn't say that, because what is the command given in Revelation? Don't measure the outer court, which if it was measured would tell you it's Ezekiel's, because it has a very, very specifically big area to measure. But he says, don't measure the outer court, because it's going to be given to the Gentiles, the holy city they're going to tread 40 and 2 months, second half of the 70th week. If John was given the command to measure it, rise, measure the temple of God, the altar, and them that worship therein, but the court which is without, leave out and measure it not. If he was given the command to include that, you would know beyond a shadow of a doubt it's Ezekiel's, because Ezekiel's outer court is massive. However, when there is desolation caused at that temple in the 70th week, there will be a parting of the land, a casting of lots, and the parting of the land. We learn about this. We will learn about this more in Daniel 11. Midpoint of the week and after. So I'm going to read these verses to kind of give you a little bit of context for something that we're seeing once in Daniel 5, and we will see again in the end times, and a judgment for that in the end times also, just like Belshazzar is being judged in Daniel 5. So midpoint of the week, this is the abomination that causes desolation. The king shall do according to his will. He shall exalt himself, magnify himself above every god, shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done, shall be given power to continue 40 and 2 months. The same thing. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. That means the God of his fathers, that's capitalized, capital G, that's God the Father. Not going to regard him, nor Jesus, who is called the desire of women. It was a Hebrew term to be called it was the desire of all women to be the mother of Christ. So that is, a lot of people say that they think he's going to not like women because it says he shall not, nor the desire of women. They think that's like a homosexual reference. No, it was the desire of all women in those times to be the mother of Christ. So the desire of women is the reference to Jesus. Nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. But in his estate he shall honor the God of forces, a God of whom his fathers knew not, shall he honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory. He shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. People say that the covenant to start the 70th week will be like a land for peace type thing. No, it will not. It will be a reinstitution of the old covenant, which we will discuss in great detail when we get to Daniel 9. There will be a division of the land following the abomination of desolation, the desolation of the temple, which will lead to the carting off of what? the vessels in the temple, which Joel 3 tells us people are going to be judged for. Joel 3. For behold, in those days and in that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations, will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat. This is at the second coming, part and parcel with Armageddon. Will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage, Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land. Remember the command by Jesus in Matthew 24 to flee? When they see the abomination of desolation, to flee? Because if they stay behind, there shall no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. So they're going to scatter his people and part his land. And what are they going to do with the temple vessels? Because you have taken my silver and my gold and have carried into your temple my goodly, pleasant things. The children also of Judah and the children of Jerusalem ye have sold unto the Grecians, that ye may remove them far from their border. This is why in Matthew 24, after the second coming, he's going to send his angels with the sound of a great trumpet to gather his elect from one end of from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other, because they're going to be scattered. If they don't flee, they will be scattered, taken out of their land, put into captivity, and the temple vessels will be sold, cast lots for. This is following the midpoint of the week, Abomination of Desolation. Same thing. They're going to be judged for doing the same thing in the 70th week, following the rise of the beast and the declaration of him being above all that is called God or that is worship, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So they're going to do the same thing and be judged for doing the same thing in the 70th week that Belshazzar is doing now, which is toasting with sacred temple vessels. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, Solomon's temple, third exile of the Babylonian captivity. And the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. So they're using sacred temple vessels from the house of God that they destroyed in Jerusalem to toast to their strange gods. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaister of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. The king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. His knees actually knocked together because he was so terrified. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers. The king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then came in all the king's wise men. Because this is the thing that Babylon likes to do, is they like to bring all in their Chaldeans and soothsayers and astrologers and magicians who can't do anything, and then they'll remember, oh yeah, Daniel. It's like, start with him. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Then the king Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were perplexed. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. There is a man in thy kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of thy father light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. For as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams, and showing of hardened sentences, and dissolving of doubts, were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. That extra syllable there. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Then was Daniel brought in before the king. And the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now, if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler of the kingdom, if thou can do these things. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king and make known to him the interpretation. So he's like, thanks, but I don't want your stuff. I'll do it anyway. O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him, whom he would slew. Whom he would he slew. And whom he would he kept alive. And whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, chapter 4, and his mind hardened in pride, look at me, look, I'm wonderful. This comes from Daniel 4:30. The king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by my might, my power, for the honor of my majesty? There was no praise for the God of heaven, the God of the Jews, at all. When his heart was lifted up and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. He was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will. And thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thy heart, though thou knewest all this. You knew all this happened to your father, and you knew why it happened, and you're going down the same path. You've lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou, thy lords, thy wives, the concubines have drunk wine in them. And thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold and brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God whose hand thy breath is, the God in whose hand thy breath is, the God of heaven, capital G God, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. This is the writing that was written, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Babylon is done. Head of gold, lion, gone. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Paris, or Upharsin, thy kingdom is divided, given to the Medes and the Persians. This is the chest and arms of silver in Nebuchadnezzar's statue. This is the bare representation in Daniel 9. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, put a chain of gold around his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. And Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now, one thing I do want to point out, because this will probably come into play, is that Darius is a title, not a name. Just like in the book of Esther, Ahasuerus was a title, not a name. Ahasuerus was not king. Xerxes was the king. That was who Esther was married to, which is interesting because, Daniel's 70 weeks proclamation in Daniel 9, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem, that comes from Artaxerxes, who was the son of Ahasuerus from Esther. Xerxes, the son of Esther. I don't think that he was born of Esther, but it's all very closely tied together. And he was, anyway. So Darius, that is actually a title, not a name. Darius and Cyrus will come into play. Why is this important? Well, I think it's called Darius, not Darius, but whatever you want to call it. He's gonna be in play in the next couple of chapters. However, Cyrus is the one who actually allowed Israel to go back, to leave Babylon, to leave the captivity, to go back to Israel for the express purpose of rebuilding her temple in the year following the end of Jeremiah's prophesied 70 years. So know therefore and understand, I know there's a little bit of confusion about this. Daniel 9's prophecy, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem, that's the rebuilding of the city walls and the city gates. That is from Nehemiah and Ezra. Ezra and Nehemiah detail that. Ezra. Ezra details that. Nehemiah details the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem. I think it's both of them. That is different from the command to rebuild the temple. The command to rebuild the temple was just the temple, and that was given in around 537 BC, following the exile, following the end of the Babylonian captivity, given by Cyrus, circa 537 BC. The command that starts the 70 weeks count was given by Artaxerxes in the 20th year of his reign, Nehemiah 2, circa 445 BC. Those are not the same. So sorry, I was getting a little tripped up over my words. They're not the same commands. So I know that some people think that they are, and they're not. When next we meet, we will go through Daniel 6. I'm looking forward to going through Daniel 7, but we go through Daniel 6 first, and that will be an equally good chapter. As always, if you guys have any questions, comments, or feedback, let me know. Have a great night.